All right, for this section, we're going to be looking in a direction we haven't been looking, and now we're going to be centering on non-Europeans, on local peoples, colonized peoples, and their responses to imperial aggression and their resistance or lack of resistance to imperialism. So the first thing is simply that indigenous people did resist colonial violence and control, and this perdured across many generations. Um, they resisted invasion by force of arms, like they did in Matabeleland and Zimbabwe against the British. However, this was often a mismatch as the Europeans had more and better guns against spears and muskets. When we look at India, we will see next week looking at the so-called Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion, or the First Indian War of Independence in 1857, a one-year-long conflict, armed uprising against the East India Company. And so we do have armed, long-term, multi-year, multi-generational resistance to colonial violence using violence. Another form of resistance is simply withdrawal of labor. This is particularly the case in sub-Saharan Africa, where indigenous peoples were resisting colonialism by just opting out, by changing locations, by moving into an interior that's far from colonial settlement. A third method is the refusal to pay colonial taxes. The tax system, as mentioned in the previous lecture looking at cash cropping, was intended to force colonized people off the land and into a cash economy that was controlled by colonists. So that could either be by working in the mines, factories, or for cash crops. So by refusing out of this system, they risk, as we mentioned last lecture, they risk being the targets of violence, but this was, in some places, a method used. Anthropologist James Scott refers to these as weapons of the weak. So you have to do something, but you kind of drag your feet doing it. You have to work in the mines, but you don't work very effectively. You have to work in the factories, but you don't really have your heart in it. It's a weapon of the weak. You, perhaps, are required to go to class. But what do you do when you're in class? You look at your phone in your lap. You don't pay attention. You ask to go to the bathroom and you hang out there for a while. These are all of what James Scott refers to as weapons of the weak. You can't tell your teacher to go screw themselves. You can't not come to school at all, but you cannot be fully engaged. There are many, many cases, prominent cases of resistance in terms of anti-colonial rebellions against the Germans. There was the Maji Maji uprising in what's today Tanganyika. There was resistance against the Herero genocide by the Germans. The German people today have done a very good job of coming face to face with the violence that they caused in World War II, and their education system speaks to it. The education system does not speak to the genocides that they did against the Herero and others in Africa prior to World War I. Other cases of resistance, we have resistance against the French in 1916, 1962, the Tuareg Uprising, the Congo War Rebellion, the Madagascar Uprisings. There were uprisings against the Italians in the Anglo-Italian War, and that's the image you see here. Yes, this is the image you see here. There was a decisive Ethiopian victory under King Menelik II. Menelik II actually purchased European weapons to use against the Italians in the Battle of Adwa in 1896. You don't need to know all these numbers and names, but the point here again is that there was a lot of military resistance to imperialism. Against the British, the most famous probably in Africa would be in the Zulu Wars, the defeat by the Zulus at eventually they lose, but at Ishwandala, the Zulus are very, very successful. The Mau Mau uprisings in Kenya. There was the Mahdi uprisings in Egypt. So there's many, many cases, and as I mentioned already, the Sepoy Mutiny in India, Nigeria, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Malawi. There's a lot of revolts and rebellions. Portuguese, also a key colonial power. The Portuguese, to be totally frank, were probably the most violent of all the European imperial powers, and they were the most brutal. And there were, in the 60s and 70s, wars of liberation in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, against and others against the Portuguese. So don't let anybody tell you that Africans and Asians just took it. Same thing here in this country. We have wars of resistance against the settler state, the United States, in their movement into the West. In addition to this, we also need to think about, what does resistance look like? When we think of war in the Western framework, we think of lots of troops on each side, and the goal is to kill as many of the other people as you can. And the goal is widespread death of foot soldiers. The generals hang back. But that's not a universal method of combat. And if we look cross-culturally, using military history, looking cross-culturally, we'll see that there's a wide range of goals in war, goals in combat. Is the goal to kill, or is the goal to humiliate? This is a good point to kind of bring a connection over to the Americas, in particular in the plains here amongst the Oglala, Lakota, and others, the Crow, for example. Plains combat was quite different. The goal was to capture, not kill. It was low intensity, low casualty conflicts, and the goal was to, in this sense, humiliate, what was referred to in English amongst the plains people as counting coup, C-O-U-P, counting coup. And the goal here amongst plain combat was to demonstrate your own courage by proving superior over your opponent in a kind of competitive sense. So, and over your comrades. So you're competing against your own side in who can count coup in a way. And so what that is basically, you see in this image here, this coup stick, as it's sometimes referred to, and the goal is to count coup upon their enemies with their clubs and sticks. You basically chase them at a distance and then tap them on the head. To be really kind of simple about it. So it's about fewer numbers killed. The goal is not to wipe all of them out. You can't also count coup at a long range. The goal is not, if there's 10 of them and there's one of you, there's no real honor in that, so overwhelming numbers don't count. The goal here is to show dominance in this way. So, I think it was the King Philip War in the 1600s in what's now like Connecticut, that area. Indigenous people were horrified by European rules of combat, where the goal was just to lay waste to huge numbers of people, because that was not the form of combat in the Americas. Here we have a photograph of Spotted Rabbit, who is a crow in what's today Montana. And you see here the crow stick, the counting coup stick. We also need to consider that some indigenous peoples benefited by supporting the colonizer. The world wasn't some utopia, peaceful place where no one was in conflict prior to European colonization, there were Africans fighting Africans. There were indigenous people fighting indigenous people. And when the Europeans came, remember, this is a small number of people coming at first, under 100, under 1,000, and they have these guns or these weapons. And they're like, oh, well, they're no threat to me. This 100 Spanish people are no threat to me, but I can use them to defeat my long-standing enemy. The example that comes to mind is actually kind of old imperialism from the 1500s in what's today Mexico, and that's what we see in this image here. The Tlaxcalans, and I'm sorry I'm not pronouncing that correctly, they were the enemy, long-term enemy of the Aztecs. And when Cortez and his crew came through, the Aztecs, who controlled the city of Teotihuacan, excuse me, I'm also not saying that right. The Tlaxcalans said, oh, here's our chance to take over the big Aztec capital city. We're going to work with Cortez, and we're going to take over the capital city, and these weirdos will leave. Unfortunately, the weirdos, from the Mesoamerican perspective, the weirdo Spanish never left. But we see indigenous peoples using colonizers to sort out long-term conflicts. There's also the case, and we came to it in looking at indirect. When we come to looking at indirect rule, we'll see that local leadership, and that's everything from chiefs and village leaders up to kings, benefited from the stability and wealth that European imperialism brought. So in the case of India, and we'll come to it later, the Europeans basically told Indian kings, hey, you guys keep paying us a tax, and we will guarantee your borders, and you will be able to rule this area in perpetuity. So from the king's perspective, it's like perfect job security. And all they need to do is kick over some tax to the Europeans. So local leadership benefited from European imperialism. Okay, so we'll hold it there, and when we come back, we'll start looking at the structure of colonial occupation.